The hospital room was a cage of sterile white walls and beeping machines. Arthur Grayson, at 72, lay tethered to an IV drip, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a heart that refused to quit. The ICU was no place for dreams, only for survival. Each breath was a battle, and every heartbeat a small victory against the pneumonia that had sunk its claws into him. His silver hair, once meticulously combed, was now matted against his forehead, damp with sweat. His hands, calloused from years of labor, trembled slightly as they gripped the thin hospital blanket. Arthur had built a life from nothing. A carpenter by trade, he'd turned a small workshop into a thriving furniture business in the heart of Portland. His hands had shaped oak into heirlooms, and his heart had shaped a family, or so he thought. His daughter, Emily, and her husband, Greg, had been his pride. He'd given them everything, a stake in the business, a home, and his unwavering trust. But trust, Arthur was learning, could be a fragile thing. 3 days ago, he'd overheard the nurses whispering about his condition. Critical, but stable. They said, stable. The word felt like a cruel joke. His world was anything but. Emily and Greg hadn't visited since the first day he'd been admitted. They'd sent a text, a cold string of words. Dad, we're so sorry, but we had to go to Hawaii for Greg's work conference. We'll check in soon. Love you. Hawaii. While Arthur fought for air, they were sipping cocktails under palm trees. The betrayal stung deeper than the needles in his veins. He'd given them the business to run, believing they'd honor his legacy. Instead, they'd left him to face death alone. The hospital's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, mirroring the static in his mind. How had it come to this? Arthur's thoughts drifted to his childhood. He'd grown up poor, the son of a factory worker who drank away half the family's income. Arthur had vowed to be different. He'd worked nights to put himself through trade school, built his business from a single workbench in his garage. Every chair, every table, was a piece of him. When Emily was born, he'd carved her a cradle with his own hands, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He'd dreamed of passing it all down his craft, his values, his love. But Emily had changed. She'd married Greg, a slick-talking finance bro with a smile that never reached his eyes. Arthur had ignored the warning signs, Greg's insistence on modernizing the business, Emily's growing distance, the way they'd started treating his workshop like a cash machine. He'd trusted them to care for it while he was sidelined. He'd trusted them to care for him. The ICU was quiet at night, save for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Arthur stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for clarity. Had he been blind? Had he raised a daughter who could abandon him so easily? The questions gnawed at him, sharper than the pain in his chest. A nurse, a kind woman named Clara with gray streaks in her hair, checked his chart. You're a fighter, Mr. Grayson, she said softly. Most folks your age don't push through like this. Arthur managed a weak smile. Got no choice, he rasped. Still got things to fix. Clara's eyes held a knowing warmth. You'll get there, one step at a time. But Arthur wasn't thinking about steps. He was thinking about justice, about the business he'd poured his soul into, about the betrayal that burned hotter than his fever. If he survived this, he'd make sure Emily and Greg understood the weight of what they'd done. He wasn't just a sick old man in a hospital bed. He was Arthur Grayson, and he wasn't done yet. As the night wore on, Arthur's mind sharpened. He began to piece together a plan not out of spite, but out of necessity. He'd built his life on fairness, on earning what you got. If Emily and Greg thought they could take his legacy and leave him to die. They were about to learn a hard lesson. By morning, his fever had broken. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. But Arthur's focus wasn't on his recovery. It was on the future. He asked Clara for a pen and paper. His hands shook as he wrote, but his resolve was steady. He'd start with the business records. He'd call his lawyer, Margaret, a fierce woman who'd handled his contracts for decades. If Emily and Greg thought they could walk away unscathed, they were wrong. Arthur's heart monitor beeped steadily, a metronome to his newfound purpose. He wasn't just surviving. He was preparing. For what? He wasn't entirely sure yet. But one thing was clear. The man who'd built an empire from sawdust and sweat wasn't going down without a fight. Arthur's hospital room felt less like a prison now, more like a war room. The pen in his hand was his weapon, the paper his battlefield. Each scribbled note was a step toward reclaiming what was his. His lawyer, Margaret, had visited that morning, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if sizing up the stakes. "You look like hell, Arthur," she'd said with a wry smile. "But I've seen you pull through worse." "Worse than betrayal?" he'd asked, his voice hoarse but steady. Margaret's smile faded. "Tell me everything." And so he did. He told her about the text from Emily, the Hawaii trip, the way the business had been slipping through his fingers even before he'd landed in the ICU. Margaret listened, her pen moving as fast as his words. When he finished, she leaned back, her expression unreadable. "You want to protect your legacy," she said. "We can do that. But it won't be easy." "I don't care about easy," Arthur replied. "I care about right." Margaret nodded, promising to dig into the business's financials. Arthur had given Emily and Greg control of the day-to-day operations 2 years ago, believing it would ease his load as age crept in. He'd trusted them to honor his vision. But now, lying in the ICU, he couldn't shake the suspicion that they'd been siphoning more than their share. His mind drifted to the early days with Emily. She'd been his shadow in the workshop, her tiny hands clutching a sandpaper block as she helped him polish table legs. "Daddy, will I make furniture too?" she'd asked once, her eyes wide with wonder. Arthur had laughed, ruffling her hair. "If you want to, kiddo. This place will be yours someday." But somewhere along the way, Emily's wonder had faded. She'd gone to college, met Greg, and returned with a new perspective, one that valued profit over craft. Greg had pushed for mass production, outsourcing to cheaper suppliers, cutting corners Arthur had spent decades perfecting. Arthur had resisted, but Emily's pleading had worn him down. "Dad, we need to grow," she'd said. "This is how businesses survive." He'd relented, thinking it was what she needed to feel invested. Now, he wondered if it had been a mistake. Had he given them too much? Too soon? Had he taught her to take without giving back? Clara, the nurse, checked in that afternoon, adjusting his oxygen. "You're looking stronger," she said. "Writing must be good for you." "It's keeping me sane," Arthur replied, tapping the notebook. It was filled with names, dates, and numbers, every detail he could recall about the business. He'd built it on transparency, but now he saw how naive he'd been. Emily and Greg had access to everything: bank accounts, contracts, client lists. If they'd been careless or worse, Deliberate needed to know. That evening, Margaret called. Her voice was grim. "I've got preliminary numbers, Arthur. It's not good. There's money missing, significant amounts. Withdrawals from the business account, undocumented expenses, even a second set of books." Arthur's heart sank, but his anger flared. How much? Enough to hurt. Hundreds of thousands. Maybe more. I need time to trace it all. Do it, Arthur said, his voice like steel. And find out where it went. He hung up, his mind racing. The business was his life's work. But it was more than that. It was his gift to Emily, to his future grandchildren, to the community that had trusted his name for decades. If they'd stolen from it, they'd stolen from him, from his legacy. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Arthur lay awake, replaying every moment he'd ignored the signs. Greg's flashy car, Emily's new designer clothes, the way they'd brushed off his questions about the business's declining profits. He'd chalked it up to their ambition, their youth. But now, it felt like greed. By morning, Arthur's condition had improved enough for the doctors to talk about moving him to a regular ward. He barely listened. His focus was on the notebook, now filled with a timeline of events, a map of his suspicions. He called Margaret again, asking for a full audit. I want every transaction, every signature, he said. If they've been stealing, I want proof. Margaret hesitated. Arthur, if this goes where I think it's going, it could tear your family apart. He closed his eyes, picturing Emily's face as a child, then as the woman who'd left him for Hawaii. They tore it apart first, he said quietly. As the day wore on, Arthur's strength grew, fueled by purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for justice, for the values he'd tried to instill in Emily. If she and Greg thought they could bury him in the ICU, they were about to learn how wrong they were. He'd built his empire with his own hands. He'd tear it down and rebuild it if he had Togus to make things right. Arthur's transfer to the regular ward felt like a small victory. But the war was far from over. The new room was brighter, with a window overlooking a gray Portland sky. Rain streaked the glass, mirroring the turmoil in his heart. He was breathing easier now, the oxygen mask replaced by a nasal cannula. But the weight of betrayal pressed harder than ever. His notebook, now dog-eared and smudged, was his constant companion. Each page was a step closer to the truth. Margaret's calls came daily, each one a piece of the puzzle. They've been clever, she said one afternoon, her voice tight with frustration. Offshore accounts. Shell company sits a maze. But I'm following the money. Give me a week. Arthur. A week, he repeated, his fingers tightening around the phone. I've got time. He didn't. Not really. Every day in the hospital was a reminder of his mortality. At 72, he'd never felt old until now. The pneumonia had stripped away his strength, leaving him frail but not broken. His mind was sharper than ever, honed by anger and purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his business. He was fighting for the man he'd always been, someone who stood for fairness, who built things to last. Clara, who still checked on him despite his move to the ward, noticed the change. You've got fire in you, Mr. Grayson, she said, adjusting his fore. Most folks would be resting, not planning a revolution. Arthur chuckled, the sound rough but genuine. No rest for the stubborn. Clara. She smiled, but her eyes held concern. Just don't burn yourself out. He nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He'd started writing letters not to Emily or Greg, but to himself. Notes about what the business meant, why he'd fought so hard to build it. It was his legacy, yes, but it was also his promise to the world that hard work and honesty could create something enduring. Emily and Greg had broken that promise. He wouldn't let them destroy it. That evening, a visitor arrived a surprise. It was Tom, one of the old craftsmen from the workshop. Tom was pushing 60, with hands as weathered as Arthur's and a loyalty that ran deep. He'd worked for Arthur for 20 years, shaping wood with a care that matched his boss's. "Heard you were in here," Tom said, his voice gruff. "Didn't feel right. You being alone." Arthur's throat tightened. "You didn't have to come." "Bull," Tom said, pulling up a chair. "You'd do the same for me." They talked for hours. About the workshop. The old days. The pieces they'd crafted together. Tom's presence was a reminder of what Arthur had built, not just furniture, but a community. When Tom mentioned the business's recent struggles, late payments to suppliers, rushed orders, unhappy clients, Arthur's suspicions hardened into certainty. "Emily and Greg," he said quietly. "They're running it into the ground." Tom's jaw tightened. "I didn't want to say it, but yeah, they're cutting corners, pushing us to churn out cheap stuff. It ain't your way, Arthur." "It's not," Arthur agreed. "But it's going to stop." Tom left with a promise to keep an eye on the workshop, to report back anything unusual. Arthur felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this. There were still people who believed in what he'd built, who'd stand by him. The thought fueled him, pushing him to keep writing, keep planning. By the end of the week, Margaret had more. "It's worse than I thought," she said over the phone. "They've been diverting funds to a personal account in Greg's name. Over $1 million. Arthur, I've got enough to prove it, but we need to move carefully. If we go legal, it'll be a fight." "Then we fight," Arthur said, his voice steady. "Set it up." He hung up, staring out at the rain. $1 million. His life's work bled dry while he lay in the ICU. The betrayal was a knife, twisting deeper with every revelation. But Arthur wasn't the type to wallow. He'd survived worse: poverty, loss, the grind of building a business from nothing. He'd survived this too. That night, he wrote a new note in his book. Not a plan, but a vow. "They took my trust, my money, my time. I'll take it all back and more." The words felt like a contract, binding him to a path he couldn't turn back from. Emily and Greg had left him for dead. Now, they'd face the consequences of a man very much alive. The hospital ward had become Arthur's command center. His notebook was now a thick stack of pages, filled with timelines, financial details, and a growing list of allies. Tom's visit had lit a spark, reminding him that his legacy wasn't just in the money or the business, it was in the people who'd worked alongside him, who shared his values. He wasn't fighting alone. Margaret's next visit brought a briefcase full of documents. "This is it," she said, spreading papers across the hospital tray table. Bank statements, transaction records, emails. They didn't cover their tracks as well as they thought. Arthur scanned the pages, his heart pounding. Withdrawals dated back 2 years, coinciding with when he'd handed over the reins. Large sums funneled to an account labeled consulting fees for a company that didn't exist. Greg's signature was everywhere, but Emily's name appeared on approvals, on contracts. His daughter, complicit. How could she? He whispered, more to himself than to Margaret. Margaret's face softened. People change, Arthur. Greed does that. But we've got them. We can freeze the accounts. File for fraud. It's your call. Arthur leaned back, the weight of the decision pressing down. He could destroy them legally, financially. Part of him wanted to. But another part, the father who'd carved that cradle, hesitated. Could he still save Emily? Or was she too far gone? He thought of his late wife, Sarah. She'd been the heart of their family, the one who'd taught Emily compassion. What would she say now? Arthur could almost hear her voice. Fix it. But don't lose yourself. Sarah had always believed in second chances. but she'd also believed in consequences. I want to confront them, Arthur said finally. Before we go legal, I need to see their faces, hear their excuses. Margaret frowned. Risky. They could lawyer up. Make this messier. I don't care, Arthur said. I need to know who they are now. She nodded, respecting his resolve. All right. But we prep first. You're not walking into this blind. Over the next few days, Arthur's strength returned. He could sit up without pain, walk short distances with a cane. The doctors were optimistic, talking about discharge soon. But Arthur's focus was on the confrontation. He imagined Emily's face, Greg's smug grin. Would they beg for forgiveness? Or double down? Tom called with more news from the workshop. They're back from Hawaii, he said, acting like nothing's wrong. Greg's pushing a big order. Wants it done cheap and fast. The crew's pissed. Arthur's jaw clenched. Keep them in the dark. Tom. Don't let on that I know. Got it, boss. We're with you. The loyalty in Tom's voice was a lifeline. Arthur wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the workers, the clients, the legacy he'd built. He spent hours with Margaret, crafting a plan. They'd freeze the accounts first, cut off Emily and Greg's access. Then, he'd call them to the hospital not for a family reunion, but for a reckoning. The night before the confrontation, Arthur couldn't sleep. He stared out the window, the city lights blurred by rain. He thought of the cradle he'd made for Emily, now stored in the attic of the house he'd given her. Had she ever understood what it meant? Had she ever cared? Clara stopped by, her shift ending. You're up late, she said, glancing at the notebook. Big day tomorrow. The biggest, Arthur replied. I'm taking my life back. She smiled, a mix of pride and worry. Just don't forget to take care of yourself too. Arthur nodded, but his mind was on the battle ahead. He wasn't just reclaiming his business. He was reclaiming his dignity. Emily and Greg had left him to die in the ICU. Tomorrow, they'd face the man who'd survived. And he'd make sure they understood the cost of their betrayal. The hospital room was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Arthur sat upright in his bed, his notebook closed for the first time in days. Margaret had worked her magic. The business accounts were frozen, the evidence compiled, the legal wheels in motion. Now, it was time to face Emily and Greg. Arthur's heart was a storm of emotions, anger, grief, and a stubborn flicker of hope that his daughter might still be the person he'd raised. They arrived at noon. Emily's face a mask of forced concern, Greg's smile as slick as ever. Emily wore a sundress that screamed Hawaii, her tan a stark contrast to Arthur's pallor. Greg carried a bouquet of cheap flowers, the kind you grab at a gas station. Arthur's stomach churned, but he kept his expression neutral. Dad, you look so much better, Emily said, her voice too bright. She leaned in to hug him, but he raised a hand, stopping her. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chairs by his bed. His voice was steady, commanding. They sat, exchanging a glance that didn't escape him. We were so worried, Emily began, but Arthur cut her off. Were you? His eyes locked on hers. Worried enough to leave me here while you went to Hawaii? Emily flushed. Dad, it was a work thing. We didn't have a choice. Greg jumped in, his tone smooth. It was a critical conference. Arthur. For the business. You understand. Arthur's laugh was bitter. The business. Right. Let's talk about that. He opened his notebook, pulling out a single Pagea bank statement Margaret had flagged. $1 million. Gone. Offshore accounts. Fake companies. Your signatures. The color drained from Emily's face. Greg's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. That's a misunderstanding. We've been investing. Growing the business. Stop, Arthur said, his voice like a hammer. I trusted you. Both of you. I gave you everything me work. My legacy. And you stole it. You left me to die here. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Dad. No. I'd never. Then why? Arthur's voice broke, the father in him surfacing. Why didn't you visit? Why didn't you call? I was fighting for my life. And you were on a beach. Emily sobbed. But Greg leaned forward, his tone defensive. You're blowing this out of proportion. We've been running the business, keeping it alive. You should be grateful. Arthur's anger flared. Grateful? For thieves. He tossed the bank statement at them. Margaret's got it all, every transaction. Every lie. The accounts are frozen. You're done. Greg stood, his face red. You can't do this. We've got rights. You've got nothing. Arthur snapped. You betrayed me. You betrayed the business. The workers. The clients. You're out. Emily reached for his hand, her voice trembling. Dad. Please. I didn't know it was this bad. Greg said it was for growth. For us. Arthur pulled his hand away. You signed the papers. Emily. You knew. She broke down, her sobs filling the room. Greg grabbed her arm. We don't have to listen to this. Let's go. But Emily stayed, her eyes pleading. I'm sorry. Dad. I messed up. I thought we were building something. Arthur's heart ached, but he held firm. You built nothing. You took. There's a difference. Greg stormed out, muttering about lawyers. Emily lingered, her face a mix of guilt and desperation. Can we fix this? She whispered. Arthur looked at her, seeing the little girl who'd sanded table legs beside him. I don't know, he said honestly. But you've got a lot to make right. She left, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Arthur leaned back, exhausted but resolute. The confrontation had drained him, but it had also freed him. He'd faced the truth, and now he could move forward. Margaret called that evening. They're lawyering up, she said. But we've got the upper hand. What's next? Sell the business, Arthur said. To someone who'll honor it. Tom. Maybe. Or liquidate it. I won't let them touch it again. Margaret paused. You sure? That's your life's work. It was, Arthur said. Now it's about what's right. He hung up, staring out at the rain. The fight wasn't over, but he'd taken the first step. Emily and Greg had left him in the ICU. Now, he'd put them in a financial one they'd built themselves. Arthur's discharge from the hospital was a quiet affair. No family waited to take him home. No balloons or fanfare. Just Clara, who handed him a small card with her number. You need anything, you call, she said, her eyes warm. You're tougher than most. Mr. Grayson. He managed a smile. Thanks, Clara, for everything. The cab ride to his small apartment felt like crossing a threshold. He was out of the ICU, but the battle was far from over. His body was weak, but his resolve was iron. The business his life's work was in limbo, but he'd make sure it ended on his terms. At home, Arthur sat at his old oak desk, the one he'd built himself decades ago. The wood was worn but solid. Like him. He opened his notebook, now a chronicle of betrayal and determination. Margaret had sent over the latest. Emily and Greg were fighting the account freeze, claiming they'd been misunderstood. Their lawyer was good, but Margaret was better. They don't have a leg to stand on, she'd said. We've got the evidence. Arthur's next call was to Tom. I'm out, he said, and I'm done with Emily and Greg. I want you to take over the workshop. Tom was silent for a moment. Me? Arthur, that's your baby. Not anymore, Arthur said. It's yours if you want it. You know how it's supposed to be run. You'll keep it honest. Tom's voice was thick with emotion. I'm in. For you. For the crew. They spent hours on the phone, planning the transition. Tom would buy the business at a fair price, using a loan Arthur would back. The profits would go to the workers, to scholarships for trade school kids, to the community Arthur had always served. Emily and Greg would get nothing. Days turned into weeks, and Arthur's strength grew. He walked daily, first around his apartment, then around the block. Each step was a reclaiming of his life. He avoided Emily's calls, her tearful voicemails. Dad, please, let's talk, she'd say. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. Margaret kept him updated. The legal battle was heating up, but the evidence was overwhelming. Emily and Greg's consulting fees were exposed as fraud, their offshore accounts traced. They were facing civil charges, maybe criminal ones. Arthur felt no joy in it, only a grim satisfaction. They'd made their choices. One afternoon, Tom invited Arthur to the workshop. It was strange, walking through the familiar doors as a visitor. The smell of sawdust and varnish hit him like a wave, stirring memories of better days. The crew greeted him like family, their faces a mix of relief and respect. We're keeping it real, boss, one said, showing him a handcrafted table, the kind Arthur used to make. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling its grain. This is right, he said softly. This is how it's supposed to be. Tom pulled him aside. We're renaming it Grayson's Legacy. You okay with that? Arthur's eyes stung. More than okay. That night, he wrote in his notebook not a plan, but a reflection. I built something good once. I can't undo their betrayal, but I can make sure it doesn't define me. The business will live on, not for profit, but for purpose. That's enough. He thought of Emily, of the cradle in her attic. Part of him wanted to reach out, to see if she could change. But he wasn't ready to forgive, not when the wound was still raw. She'd have to find her own way back, if she ever could. As winter settled over Portland, Arthur felt a shift. The anger that had fueled him was fading, replaced by a quiet determination. He'd survived the ICU, survived betrayal. Now, he was rebuilding not just a business, but a life. One grounded in the values he'd always held: hard work, honesty, and community. He looked out his window at the city lights, no longer blurred by rain. The storm had passed. He was ready for whatever came next. Winter in Portland was relentless, the cold seeping into Arthur's bones as he sat at his desk, sorting through the final pieces of his plan. The business was officially Tom's now, renamed Grayson's Legacy. The transition had been smooth, the crew reinvigorated by a leader who shared Arthur's vision. Clients were returning, drawn by the promise of quality over profit. It wasn't the empire Arthur had once dreamed of, but it was honest. That was enough. Margaret's updates were less frequent now, but no less critical. The legal case against Emily and Greg was moving forward. The evidence bank records, forged contracts, emails was airtight. They'd try to settle, offering to repay a fraction of what they'd taken. But Arthur refused. They don't get to buy their way out, he told Margaret. They face the consequences. He wasn't vindictive. Not anymore. The anger had burned itself out, leaving a clear-eyed resolve. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Emily and Greg had taken more than Moneyfeed taken his trust, his health, his time. He'd make sure they understood the weight of that. One gray morning, Emily showed up at his apartment unannounced. She looked different pale, her eyes red-rimmed, her designer clothes replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. Arthur let her in, his heart a mix of caution and longing. She sat on his old couch, hands twisting in her lap. "Dad," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how far it went. Greg, he convinced me it was for the business. For our future." Arthur sat across from her, silent. He wanted to believe her, but the wounds were still fresh. "I was wrong," she continued, tears spilling over. "I should have been here. I should have fought for you, for what you built. I got lost. Dad, I got greedy." He studied her, searching for the girl who'd once loved the workshop as much as he did. "You left me, Emily," he said quietly. "I was dying, and you left." She sobbed, covering her face. "I know. I hate myself for it. I want to make it right." Arthur's chest tightened. He wanted to reach out, to pull her into his arms like he had when she was small. But trust, once broken, wasn't easily rebuilt. "You can't undo what's done," he said. "The business is gone. Tom's running it now. The money's gone tootied up in court. What's left? Emily." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "Us. Our family. I want to be your daughter again." The words hit him like a punch. He thought of Sarah, of her belief in second chances. But he also thought of the ICU, the loneliness, the betrayal. "That takes time," he said. "And work. You've got to earn it." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "I will. I promise." She left soon after, and Arthur sat alone, staring at the cradle he'd brought down from the attic. It was still perfect, its curves smooth under his fingers. He wondered if Emily could ever understand what it meant, not just the wood, but the love it represented. Margaret called that afternoon. "They're settling," she said. "Greg's taking the fall, pleading guilty to fraud. Emily's cooperating, giving us everything. She might avoid charges." Arthur exhaled, a mix of relief and sorrow. "And the money? Most of it's gone. Offshore accounts. Bad investments. We'll recover what we can, but it won't be much." He nodded, unsurprised. The money didn't matter anymore. The business was safe, his legacy secure. But Emily, that was harder. He wanted to believe she could change, but he'd learned the hard way that trust was earned, not given. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "She says she's sorry." Maybe she is. But sorry doesn't erase the past. It just opens the door to a future if she's willing to walk through it. He closed the book, feeling the weight of his choices. He'd put Emily and Greg in their own kind of ICU financial ruin, legal consequences. But for Emily, there was still a chance. A small one. But it was there. And for the first time in months, Arthur felt a flicker of hope. Spring arrived in Portland, the city blooming with new life. Arthur stood outside Grayson's Legacy, the workshop's sign gleaming under a fresh coat of paint. Inside, the hum of saws and the scent of wood filled the air. Tom had done more than keep the business alive, he'd made it thrive. The crew worked with a purpose Arthur hadn't seen in years, crafting pieces that honored his original vision. It wasn't his anymore. but it was his in the ways that mattered. Arthur's health had improved, though he'd never be the man he was. He walked with a cane now, his steps deliberate but steady. The ICU was a memory, a scar that ached but didn't define him. He'd come through not just the illness, but the betrayal, the loss, the fight to reclaim his life. The legal battle was over. Greg was serving a 3-year sentence for fraud, his charm no match for the evidence. Emily had avoided charges, but not consequences. She'd lost the house, the car, the lifestyle she'd chased. She was working now, a receptionist job at a small office, living in a modest apartment. She called Arthur weekly, her voice tentative but earnest. "I'm trying, Dad," she'd say. "I want to make you proud again." Arthur listened, but he kept his distance. Trust was a slow build, like sanding a rough edge until it was smooth. He saw glimpses of the old Emily, the one who'd loved the workshop, who'd laughed with him over sawdust-covered lunches. But he wasn't ready to let her back in fully. Not yet. One afternoon, Tom invited him to a community event at the workshop. They'd started a program, teaching local kids the basics of woodworking. Arthur watched as a teenager, no older than 15, shaped a block of oak under Tom's guidance. The boy's hands were clumsy but eager, his eyes bright with possibility. "That was me once," Arthur said, his voice soft. Tom clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Still is, in a way. These kids theory your legacy too." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. He'd lost so much his daughter's trust. His business as he'd known it, but he'd gained something too. A community that carried his values forward. A purpose that outlived his mistakes. That evening, Emily came to the event, uninvited but not unwelcome. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the kids work. Arthur approached her, his cane tapping the floor. "You're here," he said, not accusing, just stating. "I wanted to see it," she said. "What you built. What it's become." He studied her, seeing the weight of her choices in the lines on her face. "It's not mine anymore," he said. "It's theirs. But it's still what I believe in." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Dad. For everything." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Instead, he handed her a small wooden box, one he'd carved in the hospital during his recovery. "Open it later," he said. She clutched it, her hands trembling. "Can I keep coming? To see you? To help here?" Arthur hesitated, then nodded. "One step at a time." She smiled. A fragile thing, but real. And for the first time, Arthur felt the possibility of forgiveness, not full. Not yet, but enough to start. That night, he sat at his desk, the cradle beside him. He opened his notebook and wrote one final entry. "I survived the ICU. I survived betrayal. I rebuilt what mattered. Emily's got a long road, but so did I once. Maybe she'll make it. Maybe we both will." He closed the book, looking out at the spring night. The city was alive, and so was he. His legacy wasn't just in the wood or the workshop, it was in the choices he'd made, the people he'd touched, the second chance he was willing to give. He'd put Emily and Greg in their financial ICU, but he'd also left a door open. For Emily. For himself. For a future neither of them could yet see, but one worth building.